to shake your windows and rattle your walls, but the times they are changing. Yes, they're changing.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of MindShift Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Clint Heacock, welcoming you back to another show. I'm bringing you today a conversation that I had with Sarah Smith. She is the host of the Theosophia podcast, which you can find on Theology Corner Network as well as other podcast platforms. And in fact, I'm going to put a link to her show in the show notes. And she's also a writer, a contributor with me on Theology Corner's blog. So you can go on Theology Corner and check out some of Sarah's writings. In fact, what's interesting, when I first met Sarah, it was last year when the whole Andy Savage High Point Church scandal was just coming out. And I wrote an article on it right around the same time that she did. And it was really interesting to compare where we were taking it because as a woman, she's got a very distinct, obviously a unique point of view on this whole story. And so you can check out that article written by Sarah Smith on Theology Corner. Now, who exactly is Sarah Smith? Well, I can tell you a little bit about her. She originally hails from Oklahoma City in the United States. And of course, in addition to being the host of the Theosophia podcast, her bio is pretty amazing. She is a theologian, she is a teacher, and she is a coach. And obviously, we'll talk about this in just a few minutes, but sports has always been a big part of Sarah's life, and now she is a coach. She's also in the ordination process in the Episcopal Church Diocese of Oklahoma, so she is well on her way to becoming a minister in the Episcopal Church. She also leads pub theology gatherings for various churches in Oklahoma City. She also, we'll talk about this a little bit, but she played softball at the University of Notre Dame, and she studied Catholic systematic theology. She's got 2 master's degrees, one from Northern Colorado in sports administration, one from Vanderbilt University in theological ethics. Now, why did she start the Theosophia podcast? Well, she started it back in December of 2017. Her goal is to empower and promote women's voices in theology and religion. And if you look at some of the people she's interviewed, it's just amazing. And we'll get into some of this in a few minutes about some of the women that she talks to, kind of perhaps women that you've never heard of before, but they are doing amazing things in theology and religion alike. So the thing I'm fascinated about with Sarah is that she's been able to retain some aspects of her Christianity, although it's vastly different today than it was when she was growing up in an evangelical church. So I don't want to get too much ahead of myself. She's got an absolutely amazing story, and I'm just really happy to be bringing you this chat with Sarah. In fact, it's been kind of a whole season. I've had loads of women on this podcast, which I think is absolutely fantastic. Going back, we had Dana Stinson a few weeks back. Then I had Valerie Wade and Deanna Adams, who of course were contributors to Karen Garth's new book, Women v. Religion. And then last week we had Karen on there. And it's funny because it kind of dovetails with some of the stuff that Sarah and I are going to get into in this episode. You know, I've titled this thing Burning Down Patriarchy, and I'm going to let Sarah explain what she means by that. But, you know, you look at what Karen is talking about in terms of the Abrahamic religions, not just Christianity, but how the whole narrative of these religions has been set up with a male God and also patriarchy in terms of the people who are in charge of these religions have typically been men. And as a result, in those Abrahamic religions, women have come off being treated horribly, being treated, as Karen talked about last week, how women within those religions have been treated by men. It's pretty bad. You know, they're kind of on the same level as slaves or being treated like property by men or as a commodity. And we touched base a little bit on some of the legal codes in the Old Testament and, of course, how women have been treated within Christianity and Islam, too. In other words, all 3 of these religions have long had a history of patriarchy and abuse of women by men. This is something that's very near and dear to Sarah's heart too, so we want to talk more with her in a minute about what she means by burning down patriarchy. I just want to say really quickly that if you are wanting to get a hold of me, you can do that on various social media platforms, and I've got all that in the show notes, as well as Sarah's contact information And as I said, I'm going to put a link to her podcast on there. So if you want to listen to Theosophia and find out where she's coming from, you can check out some of the episodes there and subscribe to that. You can find me on Twitter. Follow me there at MindShift 2018. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, various other platforms. So those links are always in the show notes. Also, if you want to help me support the show, that would be great. You can do that for as little as $1 a month. You can go to patreon.com/MindShift podcast, and you can find out more about why I started the show and what it means to become a patron. You can also support it on Podbean as well if you're an Android subscriber to that. Also, I would ask you to leave a review of the show if you could on iTunes if you found the content helpful at all or challenging. You can also email me and talk to me about anything really, your questions, comments, feedback. You can give me suggestions for future show topics and anything else that you think of. And in fact, speaking of future episodes, I'm going to mention right now before we get into the conversation with Sarah that coming up next week, I've got an amazing conversation with Stacey Ray, the resting traveler. We're going to be talking about her brand new book that is literally hot off the presses. It just came out a few weeks ago. I've been talking to Stacey for the last couple of weeks because, as I've mentioned before, she is a member of our post-evangelical writers group that I started on Facebook just a few months back in about, I think it was November, and we've already got almost 250 people in that group, and she's going to be one of the contributors to this collaborative book that we're working on. It's called Into the Wilderness, Life After Evangelicalism, and in fact, chapters are starting to be due on that right now, around about the end of this month, so people are starting to drop their drafts into me, so I'm really excited to read what some of the things that people have come up with in their chapters. We're talking about specific doctrines that affected people when they were in evangelicalism and what happened to them in terms of mental health, emotional health, sexuality, and things like that, and what it did to them and how they essentially got out of it and are finding life after evangelicalism. And this is something that I'm interested to talk with Sarah a bit about more too, because what I've found is that there's a lot of people on this spectrum who have perhaps walked away from church, but they didn't necessarily abandon God. Some did, though. Some became absolute angry atheists. Some are agnostics or just simply atheists. They don't believe in God anymore. They've jettisoned the whole thing. But people like Sarah and Stacey, they're amazing because they've redefined in a way their views of God, even though they had some rough experiences in the evangelical church before. How did they do that? That's what I want to find out, because I think there's a big segment of people who are done with evangelical churches or the institutional church, but where do they go from here? And there's a way perhaps to retain your worship of God, your even Christianness, whatever you want to call that, being a Christian, but it's been deconstructed and then in a way reconstructed. So a person like Sarah, and we're going to hear as well from Stacey next week, how do you do that? How is this possible? So if that sounds like something that maybe you're wrestling with, maybe these are questions you're asking yourself too. How do you do it? Well, let's find out what Sarah Smith has to say on this subject. Let's see how she plans to burn down patriarchy. I'm so happy to be here with Sarah Smith. You are the host of the Theosophia podcast, as well as a contributor to Theology Corner.
That's right. Although I like to pronounce it Theosophia, but Theosophy, that's okay. I mean, that's fine.
I was going to ask you about that, actually. Theosophia. Why did you name your podcast Theosophia? I'll pronounce it right from now on. How about that?
That's fine. You know, Sophia and the tradition, the wisdom tradition in the biblical text has been very informative to me in my faith journey and my theological construction. And, you know, as a woman, seeing God in the biblical text, especially in understanding God as feminine and as woman, and seeing the biblical images of God as woman is super helpful as a woman. And I definitely think as men too, it would be very helpful to think of God outside of this patriarchal, male-dominated king, ruler type personality, because that's not the only image of God that there is in the text and throughout tradition. So I kind of wanted to reclaim that word and maybe not reclaim it, but bring it to the forefront of like, this is a tradition within the Christian tradition as a whole. And Theo means God, Sophia means wisdom. So it's two kind of a male word, a male Latin rooted word or Greek word, and Sophia is the female Greek word that's bringing both together, the feminine and masculine kind of ways we talk about God into one word, because I value both. I'm not trying to say I want to get rid of all patriarchal language, but there's a whole nother tradition we don't talk about that I want to talk about. And that's why I highlight women's voices, because women's voices traditionally have been silent. So that's kind of the whole point of my project.
Just looking at the topics that you covered, everyone I've seen so far on your podcast, you talk to women, but it's really unique and interesting women. One of the things that struck me was Julian Nussbaum. She started a church called the Lipstick Lounge, Church at the Lipstick Lounge. Isn't that the one? Or no, that was
Amy Violet.
That was Amy Violet. Amy Violet started the church in Lipstick Lounge. So, these are things that, as we'll talk about, I'm sure more, you still have a passion for this thing called the church, whatever that is, but it's certainly not, this is a lesbian dive bar. So this is not your Sunday go to meeting type church where you dress up in a suit and tie and a nice dress and a hat. So you've got this thing going, which is really interesting, because that's, I'm hoping we can talk about, is what is your view of church? Why do you care? I guess, what's that all about?
For me, has always been a broader thing. I mean, I really like the pomp and flair of going to church with the stained glass windows and the altar and, all the things, the incense. Like, I love having a sacred place set apart, but I don't think that, that's the only way in which we can do church. And I've experienced church, which to me, I think church is like where two or more people are gathered in Christ's name. To me, that's church. So that can be a lot of different things. It doesn't have, like I said, have to be the traditional, what we think of as, going to a basilica or a whatever type of church building. It can be simply gatherings.
Just a community.
Yeah.
What's your backstory? This is something else. I know we're kind of diving right into the meat of our conversation, but one of the things we talked about, we had a really good pre-interview thing that we did a couple of months ago. We tried to get this together forever. We've had to postpone and delay. I'm so glad we finally got, and then my internet started crashing about a half an hour before we started doing this recording, but it seems to be okay now. But one of the things we talked about was your backstory, and you sent me an article that you wrote. I guess it's called Lent, Mental Illness and Lent. And it's a little bit about your backstory. And you said, ever since I was little, I knew I was different. You were stressed. You were unhappy. And one of the things that struck me was you said, I never performed my gender correctly. And I could never convince myself I liked boys. So what happened when you were a child? You grew up in church. And then what happened as time went on? You were struggling with this issue of gender identity and never performing your gender correctly. Can you fill us in on that story?
Yeah, I think, as a young kid, I was extremely athletic. I was into anything being physical, climbing trees, playing sports, shooting guns. I was your typical little boy. Now, I'm not saying, and I've never struggled with my gender identity as being a woman and feeling like I'm a woman or wanting to be a man, but I was just interested in things that, we socialize little boys to be interested in. I don't think there's anything essential about my womanness that has to do with what interest I ought to have, if that makes sense. So it was difficult, and especially clothing, I felt more compelled to wear like baseball hats or running shoes instead of high heels and, like a hat instead of bows, just silly things like this, like that you wouldn't think are a big deal, because women, it's not a big deal for a woman to wear a baseball hat. Like, that's not a big deal. But like, as a young kid, constantly being told that I need to look and do certain things and not be into the things I was into as something that made me more of a boy than a girl was very confusing.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you were very tomboyish from that kind of point of view?
Yeah. But I think the most difficult thing, not just that, but like you said, my feelings, my sexuality developing at a young age, that I wasn't attracted to men, but attracted to women. And that, was even more confusing.
Yeah, very conflicted.
Because that was something that was essential to who I am, right? And how I feel and my internal thoughts. And obviously, you know, as a young person, your biology and your hormones are, you know, developing and you're feeling all these things. And it's not like anyone decides, well, today I'm going to get aroused by boys and tomorrow perhaps I'll be aroused by girls. You know, like it's something that's very innate inside of you that you can't quite control. So it was a very confusing time growing up, and I had no one to talk to, and there weren't a lot of LGBT people in the media yet or anything I could look to find answers but my church, who was where I got all of my ethical development and spiritual development from. And the church had no language to talk about this either, at least in any healthy and productive way.
Yeah, they have plenty of language, I'm sure, but it's not the kind of language you maybe needed to hear at, 13, 14, 15 years old.
Right.
Except the language must have been that it's wrong and it's immoral and it's against the Bible and it's against God's views and, men and women and all that. That's what you were hearing?
Right. Well, the biggest thing that happened, but that didn't happen until after I asked somebody. Like, this was not talked about in the church.
Right. So it wasn't
in the
a big
churches
topic.
I grew up in.
Right.
So it wasn't something we talked about. It was assumed that I was straight and liked boys. Like, that's like a assumption when you walk into a church, everyone's a certain way. So it wasn't until I confided in one of my youth ministers, then did I hear all these super negative theological understandings of my body and of sexuality and gender and how those should be performed and understood in the church.
Quote unquote normal. So you're a girl, you're gonna get married to a boy and the whole thing, you're gonna be attracted to men and that's the way God's kind of set it up. That's
Mm-hmm.
So you're hearing this kind of a message. But what happened, because you said you started loathing yourself, and I think this is a common sort of feeling that whether or not it's issues of gender, not performing your gender correctly, as you say, or even gender identity. We had a gal on here a couple of weeks ago, Dana Stinson, who came out as a trans woman in the church, and she went through a lot of the same types of things. She knew it was quote unquote wrong and immoral and evil, and she was going to be going to hell. So this is very conflict.
Right.
I mean, this is why teens commit suicide in some cases. They can't reconcile what they're being told with what their feelings are. So what happened then?
Yeah.
You were going down this route of anxiety, depression, loathing. What ends up happening in this church?
Well, I begged and pleaded for them not to tell my parents, and they did. And I was probably 16 when that happened. And I knew, life was not going to be the same, and I probably needed to figure out an exit strategy. So, like I said earlier, I was very good at sports from a young age, and I knew I wanted to play college athletics, and I wanted that experience. And I knew, too, it was my ticket out of Oklahoma. So I was really lucky and got recruited all over the country to play softball. But it was kind of touch and go once my parents found out from my church that I was struggling with homosexual feelings or whatever they said. At one point, my mom threatened to take that away from me, that softball made me gay or playing sports made me gay. And it was really hard. It was really, really demoralizing. I never felt like I got to talk about how I felt and what I was going through, and no one listened to me or walked with me. It was more of you're going to do this and you're going to suppress this and we're not going to talk about it again, and this isn't who you are, and this is what you're going to do. So it was just, like I said, super confusing. I literally learned how to hate myself because I couldn't be who I was. And the church it not only just with sexuality, but sex in general was a negative thing. It wasn't a natural part of human life and flourishing. It was literally, you need to deny yourself these basic things your body's going to feel.
Yeah.
Right?
Abstinence and
this is,
purity culture, the whole purity culture thing.
Like psychologically and biologically destructive. And so what else would I do but go into depression and get super anxious and question my existence, and definitely had suicidal thoughts. And I carried this into my college experience which was the best thing I ever did, was leave to go play college softball. But the first 3 years out of my 4, I was not okay psychologically.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And it took my teammates and my coaches really loving me and holding my hand, taking me to therapy and telling me it was going to be okay, and actually walking with me through figuring myself out. And the church wasn't going to do that. And so I'm really thankful I had that experience, because it really saved my life. Notre Dame saved my life. And I have nothing but good things to say about my experience there.
The only therapy the church might offer you would be something like conversion therapy, perhaps, or something like that, huh?
Mm-hmm. And conversion therapy was something my lead minister of our church told my parents was a viable option, and they talked about it with me, and I was horrified, as you can imagine. And so it was really, really, my whole goal was to shut my mouth and not really talk about it anymore until I turned 18. So I wasn't, I was an adult and I could make my own decisions, and my parents couldn't force me to do something like that. But unfortunately, my church deemed it a life-threatening issue and told my parents before I was ready and wanted to. And that really screwed things up for me psychologically. Yeah. And it really stunted my growth and development as a healthy human being psychologically. It's been a long road of recovery and healing to be okay with myself and just to be a fully functioning human being.
Well, one of the things that I find interesting, something that's been kind of an epiphany for me just over the last few days, I was mentioning this to you earlier, that we're working on this book project through our post-evangelical writers group that I started. And I've realized that people in the group, just in the last couple of days, there's a wide spectrum of possible responses to people who leave the church or who have negative experiences of the church like you did. And some go down the road of becoming agnostics or atheists, or even angry atheists who are actually militantly kind of going back against the church and trying to talk people out of becoming Christians and talking people out of being Christians. But you didn't go that route, did you? I mean, now you're actually in the process of becoming a minister in the church. Mm-hmm. And you still believe in the church. Now, we said before, that's a very different view of the church. It's not a typical traditional church. Why did you decide to stay within the church, as broad as that may be? Why didn't you walk away and say, a lot of people do, this is bullshit, I'm out of here, goodbye? And you could totally see why you would after an experience like yours.
Right. Yeah, great question. I grew up pretty evangelical and then went to a Roman Catholic university and studied Roman Catholicism and really fell in love with liturgy and sacraments. And I never really felt I could be 100% a part of the Catholic Church, just being a woman. And, their stance on women being in leadership and being priests was problematic to me. But their theology was so rich and beautiful, and it allowed me to connect with the divine in a way I just was yearning for. And that the faith in my youth was missing, because it was I think evangelicalism lends itself to a very emotional faith that you engage emotionally and not so much intellectually. So what Catholicism and studying it brought me was that intellectual engagement that fed my faith in a different way. And I always internalized my faith as a personal thing, and my relationship with God was my relationship with God. It's the people in the church that are fucking up the church, not the church, right? It's not the Bible that's fucking things up. It's people who read the Bible. So I think there's a difference there that I've able to maintain, and I see great value in the biblical text and faith in general. I don't think Christianity has a monopoly on truth. It's something I've grown up with. Now, if I grew up with Judaism or Islam, I'd probably be Jewish or Islamic. But, Christianity is what is kind of our, cultural religion here in the States. So it's something I know and I understand, and it helps me interact with the holy. So I just think church is a way we do community with one another. And our community is a huge way throughout time. We've interpreted the text. We've created theology and tradition. I don't think faith can exist outside of community. So church, no matter what that looks like, if it's in the Christian church or if you want to go to the pub and do, drink with your friends and talk philosophy and theology, like to me, all that's church.
It doesn't have to be in a typical Sunday morning service in a church building, so to speak. But that's what church, a lot of people think church is.
It doesn't have to, but I also do like structures and systems. I do. That's one of the things that I think a lot of humans like structure and order. Like, I don't think that's a weird thing. Probably the least queer thing about me is that I really like structure. And going to a building set apart where we do these specific rituals and we're intentional about coming in community and celebrating certain things, and a place where we can go when a loved one dies to do a certain ceremony, or even doing marriages and baptisms. Again, I love ritual. I love symbol because it makes life meaningful. So I also do like the traditional quote unquote church things. But there's something also very sacramental of breaking bread and drinking wine together in the bar. So
absolutely. That's why we love living over here. There's a pub on every street corner in Britain.
Exactly.
That's our sense of community.
I'm a both and person, I do think there's something to, why I want to get ordained. And I've spent all this time getting theologically educated. I have 2 degrees in theology. Is that there's something for being educated in a particular field and being able to speak with expertise and being an expert people can go to have these conversations and understand life and just helping people, just like a physician would. My dad went to medical school and he practices as a doctor and he helps people with their GI problems. Same thing. I think theologians and people who want to be a part of the Christian church, like I said, in a more of an expert professional way, need to have degrees and be educated and fulfill those roles. And those are important, I think, to communities and civilization. Spirituality is never going to stop being a thing. Sure, church has been damaging and hurt people, but I still think it's useful and helpful.
You have a unique viewpoint then. You're coming across as a woman, you're a lesbian, you're a theologian, you're an aspiring Episcopal priest. So in a perfect world, now imagine everything's perfect in Sarah's world. What would you want to hear the church's message then? If you were saying, I'm in charge today, I get to be the one who gets to decide what the church's message is, because certainly in America today, we're seeing it's a huge perception problem, image problem. Of course, all the stuff going on wrapped up with evangelicalism and politics. Does that play into your message? What would you see the church as being?
Man, I tell you who does church really well. 2 places I've seen who do church really freaking well. First of all, Alcoholics Anonymous. AA is one of the most utterly holistic and authentic spiritual churches this country has. If I would have a church, it would be modeled on the 10-step program. Like, it is just one of the most comprehensive spiritual journeys anyone could go on, whether you're addicted to something or not. Like, just as a human, it is such good stuff and practical application of things folks can do, because we're all broken. Like,
absolutely.
if the church is a place to do anything, it's a place where people can be loved on and become more whole and healthy. And the other institution I love and respect and admire and think does this right is Thistle Farms and the Magdalene House that Reverend Becca Stevens started in Nashville, Tennessee, which helps women who've been enslaved in sex trafficking and drug addiction get off the streets and gives them jobs and therapy and counseling, and they're in these communities, and their whole model is love heals. Love heals. How simple is that?
Yeah, simple, 2 core values. Yeah, love and healing.
Yeah, so my idea of church is helping broken humans be loved on and know that they're loved, and be in communities where they can heal and become better human beings. I don't give 2 shits. I mean, I do a little bit care about politics and what's happening, but I think we're missing the point, and we're not valuing human life enough in general that we're willing to do the practical steps to help people heal and become better humans. We get stuck up on, oh my God, what are people doing in the bedroom? And is it okay to lay our hands on them and say they're married and it's okay that they're gay? Or should women be in leadership? Oh my God, that's going to tear down everything. Like, these conversations are ridiculous. They're missing the point of being in happy, healthy, thriving relationships.
I think the reason that politics and gender issues are important in that sense from a cultural point of view is that it's setting the church in America right now on a particular trajectory, at least a portion of it. Look at a guy like John Piper, for example, who came out a few months ago. I think it was a podcast that then they posted the transcript as an article, and it was basically about how someone asked, can women teach in theological seminaries? And of course, John Piper said no, because his view of the Bible says that not only should women not be allowed to preach and be in leadership roles in churches, that also means that they shouldn't be in a position of authority over men who are on the path toward becoming pastors and church leaders. So at least his views, it's logically consistent. Whether or not you agree with it or not, that's another story. But you were saying something about the Bible. Well, that's one instance where the Bible's being used or possibly abused to, keep women down and to keep women from teaching in seminaries for sure, and preaching and leading in churches. So it's not a benign book. It's not just a sort of an empty thing. We get out of it what we put into it.
Right.
We read into what we want to see out of it. Here's John Piper saying, no, women shouldn't be teaching in seminaries even.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing new. That's not a new argument, but
Exactly.
Neither is women being in leadership or preaching or that's not new either. So, John, cool. Like, stick with your guns, go with your conservative view. I don't think it's the correct interpretation of the text, but he's entitled to his opinion and his interpretation. I just say to people or things like that and people that are watching that, like, don't support that. Don't support him. Don't support institutions that support him. Like, make sure the institutions and churches and things you're investing your time and money in value the things that you value. Like, I don't understand when I have friends going to churches who don't allow women in leadership or LGBT people to get ordained. Like, why are you going to this church and keeping this thing thriving that you don't agree with?
They read the Bible a particular way, and that's you're not part of that.
Right. Again, that's fine. Like, there should be multiple ways to read the text and go for it. But if you don't believe in that, don't support the institutions that believe in those things.
We talked about this the other day. We talked about this issue of reading the Bible prescriptively or descriptively, and I think that's a real important kind of point to make, that when people read the Bible, like John Piper, he's reading it prescriptively. So he sees a passage that talks about women should be silent in the church and other texts that he's going to bring out, and he's saying that should be prescribing. So for example, where Paul talks about homosexuality, whether or not he was homophobic, we don't know, but these texts are read prescriptively. So gay people shouldn't be allowed to be in positions of leadership, or they need to, have conversion therapy. Or is it descriptive? Is it just describing one person's point of view? Maybe Paul was homophobic and it's just descriptive literature, and we need to read it more or less as a case study, as what issues he was dealing with at his time. And I think for a lot of people in evangelicalism, the Bible is read prescriptively, and that's why they come up with so many rules, don't they? Instead of just saying, well, this is what they were struggling with back then, but today it's different. So we need to read it a little bit more descriptively. I don't know. What do you think? Do you read the Bible prescriptively or descriptively? Where do you land on that kind of spectrum?
Great question, Clint. I think the Bible, I probably in general, I read it both ways. I really do. I want to tell you one way or the other, but I don't think a good theologian would tell you they read it one way or the other. I think we do it both ways, because theologians, when we come to the text, now I'm not a Bible scholar. That's why I'm saying I'm a theologian.
Yes, you're speaking as a theologian.
I interpret tradition and what we create, what we think about God and about ethics. Certainly the Bible is one thing we use to create theology and ethics, but it's just one thing that I think is authoritative in my faith. So I also believe the tradition of the church, fathers and mothers, and their writings and wrestlings with the text and conversations parsing out what the Trinity is or what atonement is, right? Like these things aren't necessarily in the biblical text, but truths we've gleaned from reading the text over, millennia.
Yeah, people have been wrestling with it forever.
Also reason and experience are authorities through which I read the text. So I think there's different times to read it prescriptively. In certain texts you can read prescriptively, and there's certain texts you can read descriptively. Like, for instance, God, Jesus saying, love your neighbor as yourself and love God with all your heart and mind and strength. I think that's pretty prescriptive. I think that's a good thing to be prescriptive, right?
It's a pretty simple
but
statement.
Descriptively, Paul talking about, women's salvation comes through childbearing. Like, what? Like, no, like.
What is that
about?
That,
to me, is, like, people even argue if Paul actually wrote that, first of all.
Yeah, whether or not it's authentic and all that.
And second of all, a lot of things in the text are cultural. They're definitely describing what's happening, and they're stories that have been told orally over thousands of years. So to say everything and everywhere in the Bible needs to be essential for all time, I think is really backwards and not helpful. Because we're not going to say slavery is okay anymore, but the Bible clearly says it's okay. But we've moved on from that, right? Like, I think the Bible is very complex, and to boil it down to just reading it one way, I think does violence and harm to the text.
It ends up doing and damage to people as well. Obviously, it's certainly damaging to women. It was used to justify slavery. And equally, the Bible was used to condemn it by the abolitionists. So it's the ultimate irony. The exact same text. Half the people are saying God says slavery is good and okay because for various theological and biblical reasons, and yet the abolitionists are holding their Bibles and saying no, it's God wants everyone to be free, and so it's the same text. So yeah, these are great examples, like you say, of people wrestling with it in the past. You said the other day when we talked, you said reason, tradition, and scripture. It's kind of a three-legged stool. Each one of those legs is important. There's none perhaps more important than the other, because obviously if you kick one of the legs out of that stool, the whole thing's going to come crashing down, isn't it? Why is that so important to kind of have that balanced model of reason, tradition, and scripture?
Because otherwise you end up making one of them an idol, which I think is what evangelicalism, I think that's what their problem is right now. And I'm speaking very generally, but I think so many people I see holding up the Bible as the one source of authority. And I'm like, but you never read it without your own two eyes and your body of experience coming to the text. Certainly, and to say that you've read the text and you understand it is crazy talk. I have
objectively
2 degrees in this stuff. I have 2 degrees in this stuff, and I'll tell you right now, I think the Bible's the one of the most beautiful, but one of the most dangerous things to be reading by yourself.
Don't read it by yourself.
You shouldn't. It should be read in community. It was made for being read in community. So, but I also don't think my experience is the only thing that should, or my reason or tradition should be the only things that should tell me something about my faith. Simplifying things, sure, makes it easier, more palpable for people. Absolutely. But you're losing the richness and the wonder and the mystery of the whole thing when you make it so monolithic. You're missing it.
I think that's a really good point.
And I think our Jewish brothers and sisters, where we got our faith from, would be appalled at what we're doing to it.
I think that's a really good point. I love what you said, that if you take any one of those and make it the main focus, not only is the stool crashing down or imbalanced, it becomes an idol. And I can see your point exactly, that you can, any one of those things can be emphasized and thus become a dangerous thing. If we emphasize tradition completely, then we have to do everything that the church fathers said, and that could be completely out of date, can it? Or it can be very damaging or destructive, because they weren't perfect by any stretch, were they? No. Augustine said some pretty horrible things. Luther was anti-Semitic. That doesn't always work to just rely on tradition. Luther wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, was he?
No.
Or Calvin or anybody else. I mean, they burned the Anabaptists, so that was pretty horrifying. both the Lutherans and the Calvinists were burning Anabaptists along with their Catholics, so we don't really want to see that happening again today, throwing these guys in the lake and saying you need to be baptized the third time until they drowned, so it's pretty horrific.
Right.
Well, now, what about your views of God? Because going back to this point about, deconstruction, we were talking about earlier, deconstruction looks differently for everybody. And you mentioned not only is it a deconstruction perhaps, but it's a reconstruction or construction that has to happen as well. What are your views of God? Because you mentioned the gender issue of God. We've always been told, God is a he or whatever in certain aspects of theology, the maleness, the patriarchal aspects of God. You mentioned the she aspect of God. Why is that important to you as a theologian and aspiring priest to emphasize that aspect of God?
Well, first of all, I think we should talk about God in as many ways as we can think of, because I don't think God's one thing. Just like I don't think Christianity is one thing, nor is our faith one thing, and how we experience the divine is not one thing. So calling God anthropomorphic terms is fine, but, even when I say God is a woman or God is she, that's limiting God. Like, God is not just a female. Like, God isn't even gender, right? Like, we're just putting these terms onto God to help us relate to God, which is a very natural thing that humans do. Like, we kind of have to want to, interact with the holy or what people who believe in a higher power. Like, it's easier to put names on things. It's helpful sometimes. But I think, to me, I really like Mary Daly, one of the kind of mothers of American feminism, said, God's not a noun, God's a verb. And I find that way more helpful to conceptualize God than God is noun, God is father. And I think it's a classical understanding of God from the Catholic mothers and sisters of the church, are always talking about how God is mystery. At the end of the day, God is mysterious. We cannot, anything we have to say about God is not God. It fails to really understand and name God. So, as long as we have that we know when we call God Father or call God Mother, that what we're saying isn't really God. It's maybe a little bitty drop of sand in what God is, then I'm okay with that. Sure. If that's how you relate to God. But God is more energy and creativity and what makes my heart move. You know what I mean?
I understand.
God isn't just this figure in the sky. I think God is alive and moving in us and what gives me life. So it's much more abstract than I think we like to boil it down to. God is a white male. Like, that's not helpful to me.
Yeah, you're right.
And I don't think that's true to the tradition.
We have to make God somehow accessible. So the best way is to anthropomorphize God is, he's a white man in the sky. This kind of image, I think a lot of people have the image of sort of the Colonel Sanders, white guy with the nice white beard, sitting on his porch, maybe, rocking in his chair, kind of, maybe a little bit senile, I don't know, but kindly, loving, sort of overlooks a lot of things and doesn't yell at the kids running across his lawn, And that's a very comforting image of God. But you have to wonder, is that what God is? If there is a God, a lot of people question that. Is there even a God? What do you do with the problem of evil, though? Because you have a very kind of positive view of this energy, this he, she, God. What about the problem of evil? How are you able to reconcile that? What would you say on this issue of God maybe isn't all powerful, or he, she isn't all knowing? Where do you fall on that issue?
Clint, do we have time for that one? That is deep, brother.
That's huge.
Jeez.
Maybe we can come back to it on another podcast. We can do it. We can come back to that. That is a huge issue because, maybe we can move past it. But for a lot of people, it becomes an irreconcilable problem. I think the problem of evil is one of the biggest issues because everybody wants to, as you say, everybody wants to create this image of God that's accessible and loving and kind and wonderful, and it's all positive. And you go, but wait a minute, what about all this other stuff? And I think maybe that's part of the deconstruction. I don't know for people, but We'll have to come back around to that one. Well, what do you think people want? I guess that's the question. Maybe we can end with this question. One of the things we talked about before, you talked about the labels that society puts on us, women and men, gay, straight, whatever. You have this passion for emphasizing sort of the common humanity of people. It seems like your backstory is obviously hugely influential in shaping the person that you are becoming. Your mission or whatever you want to call it. What's your mission statement for Sarah Smith? What do you want to try to accomplish now?
I would like to burn down patriarchy and binary gender norms.
Okay. That's a straight answer. No. Nice. Just put it out there. So yeah, you have
negative.
That's pretty negative, but it's
super
true.
Negative, Sarah. That's, I try to be positive and uplifting all the time, but you were saying the angry atheist. I can absolutely sometimes be an angry feminist. And I think with really good reason. But,
I was going to say there's a lot of reason for that.
There's part of that, like anger absolutely fuels my productivity and my work, but I also think, anger is only so helpful. I also have to have hope, and the Christian hope of, I believe that God is alive and moving and can heal and can love and can, mend relationships and bring us to be better people. So I think that is more my focus than, burning things down. Sometimes things need to be burned down. Don't get me wrong.
Absolutely.
But I'm not going to walk into a job and say all the men need to go. Like, no, I love men. I have so many wonderful close male friends, and we are teammates. We're partners, and I'm trying to love on them as much as they love on me, and just be in community together and help each other through the world, just like I would my female friends. But yeah, if that gives you a good, hopefully, picture of my honoriness, but also my hopefulness. Yeah.
Well, and obviously it's got to have something to do with this view of God, because the maleness emphasis on God has fed into and fueled patriarchy within the church, and not just the church. I mean, I had Karen Garst on the podcast last week, and she's the faithless feminist, and she was talking about the damage that the Abrahamic religions have caused to women because of patriarchy. Sure. And it's not just Christianity, it's Judaism and Islam as well. So patriarchy is a huge issue. And the very narrative of a lot of the religions have fueled that emphasis on patriarchy. So yeah, it's a huge issue for sure, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And especially as it relates to women. I mean, not just women in leadership in churches, but the way women have been treated historically. I mean, you look at some of the passages in the Old Testament, and it's hard to read. For example, a woman is raped and she has to marry her rapist. It's hard to get your head around those kind of passages, how women were treated in ancient Israel. And you think, wow, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with that, because the problem I have with it is that's God who gave that law, apparently, according to the text. So what do you do with a God like that? So I don't know. I honestly don't know. This is part of my deconstruction, so I don't know where you're at, but I will, I was going to say we should probably let you go. I know this has been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I wish we could get more into, we'll have to come back around another time and get into the problem of evil if you really want to dive deep.
Yeah, sure.
And talk about all this stuff. And I'd love to talk about some of these things in the Old Testament, maybe, if you're interested in, these issues of how women were treated and how that's been read and then interpreted on into today.
Yeah.
Well, let's come back around again. Maybe we could set a date, maybe like 6 months, and then we'll see where you're at. We'll see where I'm at in terms of have we changed our views on any of these topics. But thank you so much, Sarah. This has been great. I've loved talking to you and getting to know you.
Yeah, thank you, Clint.
And let's circle back around maybe in 6 months and we'll do this again.
All right. Thank you, Clint. I appreciate you very much.
You know what is really blowing my mind? This is something that's really caught me kind of off guard, is meeting people like Sarah who have somehow managed to retain their Christian faith. Yes, it's going to be radically different than what it was before. And what an amazing story of how she grew up in evangelicalism. And, it could have been very easy because of the terrible treatment that she received at the hands of her church, outing her at 16, begging them not to do it, but they did it anyway. And that caused so much trauma and all kinds of emotional issues in Sarah's life. And as I say, it could have been very easy to dismiss not just the church, but God entirely. And yet she hasn't done that. And I'm finding more and more people that I interact with. In fact, the guest that's coming on next week, Stacey Ray, I think I'm going to split that into 2 episodes because it was a really great conversation. It was quite long, so I'm going to cut it in half. She's another one. She's from Canada. We've been interacting, as I've said, as part of our post-evangelical writers group. And she's another one who has somehow gone through this deconstruction and then reconstruction process like Sarah, and reads the Bible completely differently, sees God completely differently than she did before. And this is an amazing thing for me. And in fact, as I mentioned, I've had to add more and more and more categories to my article, What Happens After People Leave the Church. And in fact, I've got another guest coming on in a few weeks, Josh de Keyser. He's from the Netherlands, and we've connected through the group as well. And he's got an amazing story. He's originally from Holland, and yet he spent the last 8 or 9 years in the States doing a master's degree and a PhD. And he's just come back over to Europe, and we've been connecting and talking. And he's another one who's somehow been able to retain his view of God, although it's radically different than it was before. So if that's you, are you a person who's maybe walked away from the church? You've realized that your views of God maybe were warped, distorted, toxic, whatever, because of your background, but where are you going now? Where are you trying to retain some belief in God, whatever that God may look like? What do you do with the Bible? This is exactly what we've been talking about with Sarah, what I'm going to be talking about in a few weeks with Stacey, and then again with Josh de Keyser. So coming up in the next month or so, there's going to be some really interesting conversations around this whole piece of how do you retain your faith, whatever it may be, and what does it look like as compared to evangelicalism. So if you have been stimulated, challenged, if it's been thought-provoking to listen to this conversation with Sarah, I'd love to hear your thoughts, your comments, your feedback. And as I said before, you can find me on social media, and the connections are all in the show notes here, so have a look at that. Also, do me a favor, please leave a review of the show on iTunes. That would be really great because it helps with the show's visibility. Tell your friends about the show. If you would do that, that would be amazing. So I would thank you for that. So I'm going to let you go. Thanks once again for joining me and Sarah Smith on this discussion of burning down patriarchy. I will see you next Friday with Stacey Ray, the Resting Traveler, Part 1. You are not going to want to miss this episode or the one after that. So thanks again for listening in. I'll see you next week.
Yes,